This is the DeVane Lectures. I think it's called DeVane 200, the course. I didn't even know what the DeVane Lectures were until last year when the President's office asked me to do the DeVane Lectures. And I said, okay, what's that? Well, I've since learned there's a long tradition. Some of you have probably attended others, Ian Shapiro, et cetera, et cetera. I've talked to a few faculty who've done this now. This emanated, obviously, out of the Yale Antislavery research project, which I directed, led. I was the principal author of the book you're assigned, whether you like it or not. That book, I just learned 2 days ago. I was over at the bookstore checking on the books. The books are all in. And they told me that book just astonished me. It's the second best-selling book they've had at the Yale bookstore all summer. Well, I don't get any royalties, so don't worry about it. But I was amazed. People are actually reading it and buying it, for God's sake, in hardback. We don't even have a paperback yet. When asked to do this, I thought about it a great deal, and I've done what you've seen from the syllabus, and the syllabus is on the Canvas server. And by the way, Michael Hepp, who is still here, I think, if you are, Michael, wave. Michael Hepp in the President's office, who does everything in the President's office except be president, is coordinating all of you from the community. He will be sending you the readings that are on the Canvas server. There are 2 up for this week, for today. A piece by Drew Faust, a piece by Stephanie McCurry on Why We Love the Civil War. It's an ironic title. Well, ironic, I think, for most. Please have a look at those. I'll be reflecting on that question in just a minute, a bit. I decided to root this in the Yale Antislavery Project and in the book and in the research around it. And when we get into those lectures in the next 3 or 4 weeks, we'll have one guest lecture, but also my colleague Hope McGrath. I don't know if Hope is actually here. I don't think so. Hope McGrath from the Bind. I had a tremendous team for this book. I won't go into who all although one of them was Emily Yankowitz, who's one of my teaching assistants, who did intrepid research, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries of the Yale Project. The course is rooted in this question of, so how was Yale University connected to, entangled with, influenced by, formed by its relationships to slavery and other racial ideology from its inception, even before its inception. The book begins with a chapter on the 17th century, and particularly on the Indian Wars, the 2 major Indian wars fought here in Connecticut, the Pequot War and King Philip's War. I wish that chapter was even longer. This book became a serious problem of length and how to contain Yale's 300 and some odd years. You will see that we ended the book in 1915 for particular reasons I won't go into entirely today at all. We ended in 1915 in part because the President's office gave me a rigid deadline. That's the truth. I don't blame him. But 1 week after I turned in the manuscript, he announced that he would be leaving the presidency. And then I realized deadlines have many reasons. But I must say, too, that before I forget, Peter Salovey, our former president, owned this project. This was his idea. I didn't lobby the administration. I didn't lobby anybody to do this project. In fact, on the day he called me, I kept kind of praying silently, this isn't happening, is it? I don't really want to spend the next years. But of course, I learned an enormous amount about, well, the history of this university, which I would never have known. I can walk by buildings now, and I don't know who those people are. Some are interesting and nice. Some aren't. But we ended in 1915, particularly with the story of the Yale War Memorial, which almost nobody knows the story of anyway, but almost all of you walk by it almost every day. A word on that in a minute. I decided to root the course in this. Why are universities studying their past so much now? Why have they been doing it for the past really 20 years, actually a little more than 20 years? What's happening? Why? And why now? The now of, say, 2004 and 5, when Brown University put out its report, the now of 2014, 15, 16, when Georgetown revealed its remarkable story of its plantations and its ownership of enslaved people and so on and so forth. Harvard's report, UT Austin's report, et cetera, et cetera. There are now around 90 universities and colleges, small colleges as well, especially in the South, studying their past with slavery. In fact, at my center, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition, we've had a project going now for 4 years. We started that project before this was even born. It's called the Legacies of Slavery, and we're doing it with small colleges, small college faculty from all over the country. And we're about to culminate that project next month with a final conference in Memphis, Tennessee. There are a lot of small colleges exploring their past, not just with slavery, but especially with the problem of slavery. Why? Many reasons. I'll come back to that in 1 second. The second part of this course, as you've been able to see, and that may both interest, possibly inspire, but also frustrate some of you. It's a somewhat truncated version of my Civil War Reconstruction lecture course. I've boiled it down to the middle of the course because I believe it is very important if you want to understand today's dilemma. Put whatever label you want on it. Polarization, division, existential threats to our polity, elections that frighten us as they may inspire us, political institutions that are in dysfunction. Undergrads, please don't walk out of here today and say, man, that guy's a downer. Jesus, don't go, he's a downer, man. Not really. But I do believe history has at its core a certain kind of human tragedy that we're all part of. All of us. It's part of the human condition. We love to get around it or under it or over it. But look around. James Baldwin once said, what Americans do with their history is they cover up the sleeper instead of waking him up. Cover up the sleeper. You know, you want a good night's rest. You don't want a nightmare. Put me in a history I enjoy. Put me in a history that's fun. Joy, fun, hope. Where we win. Sorry. Everybody deserves a little parody. But you know, Baldwin also once said in an interview, he was being interviewed by no less than Studs Terkel, the great oral historian. Some of you in this room are clearly old enough to remember Studs. If you were ever in Chicago, you heard him on the radio every week or every day. I lived in Chicago for 5 years. I never missed Studs Terkel's program. He was a great, great interviewer. He would interview every writer that came through Chicago, and he wrote all these famous oral histories. And he was interviewing James Baldwin once. And actually, there's a video of it. I'm sorry, an audio of it. And you can just sort of sense Baldwin as being Baldwin. He's just shooting from the hip. He's just complaining, and he's just he's just laying one Jeremiad after another on Studs Terkel. And at one point, Baldwin says, Americans, they don't have a sense of history. They don't have a sense of history if it hit them between the eyes, and on he goes. And Terkel said, whoa, Mr. Baldwin, what do you mean by a sense of history? And Baldwin actually stops for a moment. He reflects a minute. And he says, well, I guess especially for a young person, it simply means knowing that you're not alone. Which is such a simple answer to that sense of history. Well, but and Baldwin went on from that a bit, but what he essentially meant was, whatever may happen to you, and it could be horrible. What's happening right now to you, your people or your society, your country? It's happened before, somewhere, somehow. Not exactly the same way. Historical parallels are never entirely parallel. You know, all that history repeats itself, now it doesn't, yes it rhymes, and all that stuff. You've heard all that. Parallels are the way we think, even when they're not always direct. But whatever's happening has to some degree happened before, it's happened somewhere before. That's why we do history. What do we have history for? But to ground us, to root us, and to put us in stories that sometimes do inspire us, and sometimes are fun. The third part of this course, although it's kind of going to be in and out all the way through, is, and look, I'm confessing this now, I realized this course was going to lead right up to I hear there's an election. And we have about 3 weeks left in the course after Election Day. Now, hopefully the election will be over. And we will know a winner and a loser, although we've had a few in recent history where that wasn't entirely clear. A couple, anyway. So I'm rooting this as in the title of the course. In Sinclair Lewis's famous refrain in his very famous novel, It Can't Happen Here. Can it happen here? Now, it is something I'd like to really complicate with you. It can be a lot of things. To Sinclair Lewis in 1935, in that massive bestseller, it was fascism. And we're going to read the book. How many of you have ever read Lewis's It Can't Happen Here? Yeah, okay. Well, you can get any edition you want. I think the bookstore has the Signet. It's, well, I don't need to show it to you. It's a bleak but a remarkable story about a fascist movement in America that, well, takes over. I guess by 1939 in the novel. But it can be many things in a democracy like ours, in a pluralistic society like ours. It might just be forms of authoritarianism that creep in, or forms of ideological aggression by both sides, or all sides. It could be forms of slavery, reviving. And many of you know this. I mean, there are forms of the enslavement of people in the world today, all over the world, in human trafficking, in sex trafficking, especially in labor trafficking, in the making of all kinds of products and minerals and resources. This is a hotly debated issue and question, but there are probably more people enslaved. I say probably because, boy, do people debate this one and fight about it. And they fight for grants to get more money to research it more. But there are more slaves in the world today than there certainly were at the time of the American Civil War, if you included Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. They're in different forms of bondage. They're in different forms of no exit dead ends. And in some cases, they are chattel. in those tea fields of India. And the shrimp boat, the shrimp fishing business in the Pacific, the South China Sea. And it could be a 9/11. Remember that? Some of you don't, I know. It's hard to be a teacher now. Let's see. Donald Trump, you've heard of him. Yeah, sure. Anyway, a 9/11 was never supposed to happen on American soil. I mean, how could that happen? Remember that? It was like, how could this happen? Why do they hate us? Who are they? Pearl Harbor wasn't supposed to happen. Fort Sumter was quite a long way coming, but it wasn't supposed to happen that way. There are many of these kinds of events in history. I just call them the shock of events, events that you don't see coming, and then everybody changes some kind of position to it after it happens. And those who don't study events, and I have fantastic colleagues, I have renowned colleagues who tend to study social history. I do social history, cultural history, the systems, the forces, the communities, the ideologies through which people build societies. Social history won the history revolution in the last half century. But sometimes events still occur that punctuate that, and we get shocked by them. How could that have happened? 2016 was a shock to our system. It could be something like voter suppression. There's been voter suppression throughout American history. I mean, the earliest forms of voter suppression were just disfranchisement. You're black, you can't vote. You're a woman, you don't vote. Now we have a whole variety of other kinds of voter suppression. But that's not supposed to happen either. That can't happen here. They can't do that. He can't call up and ask for 11,000 votes from the... You can't do that. That can't happen. How about disease and pandemics? I mean, oh my God. A once-in-a-century pandemic was COVID, or is COVID. I guess there's a new strand out and a new vaccine that Yale's going to have by September. Get your shots. And then there's this thing called civil war. For the first time in my way too long career, I've been living through some years now where the question from the press, and I've been on panels, I've done debates. I debated my wonderful colleague Akil Amar on this one. Forget what podcast it was. And I also did it with Rich Lowry, the editor of the National Review. No, that was on Trump. Sorry, no, that was a different one. Anyway, lots of books have come out. Is America on the brink of some kind of new civil war? Well, if so, what would that look like? What would it even mean in the 21st century? Would it look anything like the first Civil War? No. That's the easy answer. There's been a recent, very popular movie called Civil War. You've seen it by the British filmmaker. How many people saw it? It's really bloody. That's why you didn't see it, I guess. It was very popular for a month or two. Horrible. A totally dystopian story about America after its collapse. It is in the midst of civil war, and almost nobody knows even what they're fighting about. I'd urge you to see it, but, take a deep breath. It can be many things. Can it happen here? Can it happen here again? How do we know? Okay. I want to do just a couple of other things in this first gathering. I hope this course can answer a bunch of questions, at least begin to. By the way, history rarely answers anything utterly definitively. If you see a blurb on a book that says it's the definitive study, read the next blurb. I have two rules with myself for writing blurbs, and I write way too many of them. I never use the word definitive, and I never use the word contribution. I hate that word. This is a fascinating contribution to our understanding of. And all you got to do is fill in the blank. You know, contribution. We're all writing, well, of course we are. But come on, we can do better than that. You know, you got to have an action verb in your blurbs. You can't just call it a contribution. Jesus. But I do hope this course gets at some of these questions. Why and how are universities probing, telling, unearthing their own past? Why are we doing this? Why didn't we just sit this problem out as we had for decades and centuries? That's part of the underlying thread of our book on Yale and slavery. Yale didn't always suppress its history as much as it just walked around it. Just tried hard to ignore it, or tried to process it through, especially by the 19th century, a robust faith in moderation. Moderate. Yale had to stay cautious. How did this little college, forged out along the Long Island Sound by 10 ministers whose names are all above Woodbridge Hall, next time you're over, right up the street, Center Campus, Beinecke Plaza, Woodbridge Hall, what used to be called Wellesley Hall, now Schwarzman Center. Those buildings, by the way, not the Beinecke, which was built to a good deal later, but those buildings were Yale's bicentennial buildings. They were opened in 1901 for the 200th anniversary of Yale. Woodbridge Hall is named for one of the 10 founders of Yale, who was also the largest slaveholder among them. He owned approximately 26 people in his lifetime, mostly Africans or African Americans, some Native Americans. 7 of the 10 clerical founders of Yale were slaveholders. Their names are still there on Woodbridge Hall, and I think they should stay there. That's just my opinion, but it may not matter. I think they should stay there. But I think we really, really, really need to reinterpret that. That's a glorious building, by the way, national landmark piece of architecture. It's a beautiful building. But you may know it's not even occupied now. The president's office isn't there anymore. Along the way in this project, I kept just suggesting to Peter and others, why not make that the Yale Museum? Start every tour there. Explain that building. Explain the names. At the heart of the museum, have an exhibition on Yale and slavery. That's where you start. And then you can have exhibitions on all kinds of other things, all the geniuses who've come through here, the way Yale showed the world how to bring sciences into university education, the way Yale forged theology schools beyond anyone else, the way Yale did lots and lots of things. First. A third question might be how and when and against what traditions, or what they call here in the 19th century the regular order. How, when, and against what traditions did Yale develop anti-slavery ideas and action at times? There is a fledgling anti-slavery movement at Yale. We'll talk about, we'll do a whole lecture on that. By the 1830s, 40s, 50s, leading up to the Civil War, and then the Civil War tore this place apart. Mostly. It never closed. It lost all of its Southern students, and it would spend the next half century trying aggressively to get them back. Another question will be, how can we understand in a relatively short way the causes, course, and consequences of the American Civil War and Reconstruction? the most divisive event in American history, the pivot, hinge point, whatever. I mean, I know it's my field, but everybody thinks, the thing they study is the hinge point of all things in humanity. But some of us are right. The United States is a different place after that horrible war. It's a different place after Reconstruction, even though Reconstruction all but died or was destroyed. Related to that question, can the victories of the American Civil War, which have always seemed to a great degree settled, right? Emancipation. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, well, those amendments were not settled, as you may know. And we fight about the 14th Amendment every day in America. Almost 2/3 of all litigation in American courts is 14th Amendment litigation. I just signed my organization, the Organization of American Historians, of which I'm fated for my sins to be the current president. We just signed an amicus brief to the Sixth Court of Appeals before it goes to the Supreme Court about the rights of trans children to basic education. That's a 14th Amendment case. It's Section 1, 14th Amendment. And a big question. I hope you'll walk out of here with at least something to argue about the question, so what is this thing called history? What is this thing called memory? How are they different? How did you grow up with a certain, family, personal, collective memory in your mind until you got to school and they started messing it up, with history? Where does history fit with memory? Where does memory fit with history? How are they different? And lastly, I really do want to try to complicate this question. What are we going through? This is a course, more than most history courses I teach, that really wants to address the question of past and present. Not in an openly political way every day, although I've verged on that already here, apologies. But past and present are always connected. That's why I put that quote from Mark Bloch in the introduction on the syllabus. Look at that. Mark Bloch was arguably one of the most heroic historians who ever lived. He was writing his magnificent little book called The Craft of History, which is how we do history, how we think in historical ways, during his work in the French resistance against the Nazis. He wrote much of that book in farmhouses and barns and wherever he could hide. And he produced a manuscript that was about 2/3 finished before he was finally captured and executed by a Nazi firing squad in the field. But he got the manuscript to a friend who passed it on. Other people managed to finish it for him. And there's no more beautiful statement of the nature of our craft of history, especially that relationship of past and present, and God, did he know that? Than in Mark Bloch's The Craft of History. Now, sorry, I have one other thought over there. Now, good. We've all been treated to, kind of founder mania. If only we were abiding by the founders. If only we were listening to the founders. We might not be in some of the messes we get into. If only we abided by the Constitution. Well, Americans have never always abided by the Constitution. We've always fought like hell over that document. But you know what they were obsessed with? And I did not understand this until literally last year when I read Jeffrey Rosen's new book called Pursuit of Happiness. Jeff Rosen is the director of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Great constitutional historian, trained here at Yale, of course. I didn't go to Yale, by the way. I can admire all these people who did, because I didn't go here. But in this book, I'll just mention it. It's possible I'll refer to it again. Jeff was isolated at home for a year or year and a half during COVID. He couldn't go out. He couldn't go to work. So what did he do? He decided to do something all of us may dream of, but he did it. He took 4 or 5 hours every morning, did not turn on his phone, did not turn on his laptop, did not turn on anything electronic except a coffee maker, and he read the moral philosophers that the founders read. Cicero, Aristotle, etc., etc., etc. The ancients, the classical writers on virtue, and Enlightenment writers on things like civic good. And Jeff has written this beautiful book trying to show, even though these men were horribly contradictory, do you know, Jefferson had a list of his 10 most important moral philosophers. He'd read them all very carefully. You go through this list and you think, oh, Tom, how could you still own 200 people? Oh. Or John Adams, a Puritan, full of contradictions, but he read everybody. They were all obsessed with Cicero. I didn't know any of that. I didn't have that education. And now I'm trying to. But you know what they were obsessed with in crafting that Constitution? They were obsessed. Maybe you've read the Federalist Papers. If you haven't, you should. Come on. That's not patriotic. That's just damn smart to read Federalist Papers. You know, Hamilton and Madison were obsessed with this problem in different ways, with factions and passions. How do you construct some kind of constitutional entity that will hold together all of this passion in this species of ours, this human nature we have that makes us fight with each other, sometimes over the most petty things, sometimes over really big things. But how do you create a structure that could contain that? Well, what did they do? They came up with checks and balances. They came up with an independent judiciary. Yeah, I know. Oy. And they came up with that executive, a really new idea of an executive, getting rid of monarchy, not just getting rid of monarchy, but an executive that had quite a lot of power. Yeah, not as much as John Roberts just gave them, to be honest. Come on, let's be honest about that. Here's Madison in Federalist number 57. The aim of every political constitution is or ought to be first to obtain for rulers who possess most wisdom to discern. We want rulers with the most wisdom to discern. Go out and find one. And, he went on, the most virtue to pursue the common good of society. And in the next place, he said, this is key, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous whilst they continue to hold their public trust. Find the virtuous leader, and then structure precautions to keep them virtuous. Oy. Alexander Hamilton, known mostly now through songs, but in Federalist number 1, right at the beginning of the Federalist Papers, here's what he said. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. That's Hamilton asking in the first sentence of Federalist Number 1, can human beings do this? Can they create it? Can they create democracy? And live with it, within it, do it? We're 240-some years later, the Constitution has been amended and changed and fought over for a very long time. Nothing changed the U.S. Constitution like the Civil War. Nothing like those 3 great amendments. Well, how are we doing? How are we doing with all that? Okay. The last thing I want to do is reflect with you just for, I think I have 8 or 9 minutes left. Is that what I see on my watch? 10, maybe? Sorry, but this is the, yeah. That's the Yale War Memorial, in case you didn't know. Why does this period of the middle of the 19th century, the war and the Reconstruction era, have a hold on us? More books written on Lincoln, more books written on the Civil War than any other subjects, et cetera, et cetera. We could say, well, that's just because of all those nuts who are military history buffs. But that's not true. That's really not true. It may look that way in the front of some bookstores, but it's really not true. I've learned that with some of my own writings. Americans want to read history, folks. What are you doing here? They want to read history. And they want to be challenged. And it doesn't always have to be happy or progressive. Let me suggest to you 7 or 8 reasons, and there are more, and we can keep reflecting on this. You may come up with your own. If you do, let me know. I can add it to this list. Why does the Civil War and Reconstruction era, our most divisive event, which we're going to reflect forward on, back on, and so on, why does it have a hold on us? Number 1, demographics. It's still true that approximately, even with our bewildering diversity, our wonderful diversity in America, our incredible scale of Asian immigration, Caribbean immigration, African immigration, immigration from all over the world. Huge political issue, of course, but still about 1 out of every 3, it's diminishing a bit, Americans can trace their family directly to someone in the Civil War. It doesn't mean they all do it. It doesn't. I mean, they don't all get up every day and do Ancestry.com. But a lot of them do. That means there's a personal connection, and I have found this out in many ways. I had a student here once. He did a senior thesis with me. He was Korean-born. His family immigrated when he was just an infant. He grew up in Minneapolis. And he lands in my office, and he's a Civil War buff. And I was a little silly. I was a little stupid. I said, why? I mean, I should have. No. He said, I don't know. It just seems so important. I thought, God, that's the best answer you can hear from any student. Why do you study physics? Well, it's pretty important. What about astronomy? Ooh, pretty important. Good. My Korean Civil War fanatic. Man, and he was. I said, you didn't get this from your parents, did you? No. How about a high school teacher? Not really. I figured that's got to be. No. Second reason this period has a hold on us is loss. Loss. Think about it. Americans have never experienced loss in war or otherwise, war or pandemic, like they did between 1861 and 1865. Approximately 750,000 Americans died in that war from military causes. That's combat and disease. We don't even have numbers for civilian loss. There are estimates emerging, 50 to 100,000 possibly. There could be 1 million eventually of total deaths. But if you were to put the number of Civil War dead on the Vietnam Memorial per capita to the Vietnam era, which granted did last 12 years, instead of 60,000 roughly names on the Vietnam Memorial, you'd have close to 7 million. I don't think we can really imagine a memorial with 7 million names on it. Even it would be from one end to the other of the Washington Mall. Almost. Loss. And I could go on and on this one. Why is Walt Whitman one of our greatest poets? There are many reasons, and you will hear me quote him more than you may wish. He's our great death poet. He's a poet of many things. Well, actually, Whitman wrote about everything. Literally, everything. Including democracy. Read his poem called "Oh, Democracy." Read Whitman on democracy. It's Whitman who said, democracy is me learning that I must make sure that other people or my neighbor has everything I have. Sure, Walt. That ain't easy. I'm not going to share my 401k. Third, Americans love epic stories. Epic. What's an epic? Usually it's some kind of big cultural story that explains the nature of a people. Or it's a big story of death, suffering, and survival. It's sometimes a national story. Epics usually have beginnings, middles, and ends, and they have heroes and villains. And they can become very melodramatic. The Civil War fits that if you want it to. William Dean Howells, a great literary historian, critic, novelist, etc., wrote in 1900, he said, Americans love a tragedy as long as they can give it a happy ending. Give us a good tragedy. We'll figure out a happy ending for it. That's also called a Hollywood screenwriter. Fourth, modernity. I know that's an abstraction, that's a concept. What is modernity? Define it. It's got a lot of definitions. It's not just skyscrapers. It's not just industrialization. It certainly is the growth of the struggles of capital and labor. It certainly has something to do with the recreation of government itself, and indeed what we've come to call big government, which came out of the Civil War. You'll hear a lot more about that later. But the United States, such as it survived that era through Reconstruction and beyond, became more modern. And that is usually used as a positive thing, isn't it? Oh, she's really modern. They didn't say that about Madonna. They didn't know what to call her. I'm reading a new biography of Madonna. Don't ask me why. The reason is I'm on a book prize committee for biography, and there's a 900-page biography of Madonna. Nobody knew what to call her. She was so outrageous. She broke every rule there was to break. They would call her modern, no, postmodern, postmodern, and they just quit trying to figure out what to call her. Sorry? Oh. Outrageous is usually what they call her. And fifth or sixth, whatever number I'm on, the Civil War was a moral convulsion. If you're looking and there are plenty of places to find this, God knows. If you're looking for something in the past that caused a moral convulsion in the whole society, made people reorient themselves, made them recreate institutions, made them destroy things in order to recreate them in terrible bloodletting, this is an event that is a moral convulsion. You can make it romantic if you want. You know, it's a lot of heroic people struggling for what they believed in. They all fought for the right as they understood it, says the reconciliationist. But as Andy Delbanco, a great cultural historian, said, it was a modern monster who accepted Lee's surrender with laconic decency at Appomattox. The Union war machine, indeed, in order to win a war, had become a modern monster. Sixth, unity. We love unity when we can make it feel good. And it should feel good. I'm not against unity, God knows. But what have we done with our Civil War? We've tended at times, well, you'll see this. It's what Yale did right here. We took all this divisiveness, we took all this horror, all this blood, all this racism and slavery itself, and we said in the end, well, we all just got better for it. We unified out of all that division. And don't we hope for that always? Look at the Middle East. Who doesn't hope against hope that there's some way in this century, that there wasn't in the last, to some kind of unity in the Middle East? Undergraduates, solve that problem. There's a lot of Nobel Prizes waiting there. And last but not least, the Civil War is America's first great racial reckoning. How many times have you heard that phrase in our recent times? Whether it was around the George Floyd murder and all that flowed from that summer of 2020, or whether it was back when Trayvon Martin was murdered and so many other people in police situations. We were having a racial reckoning when President Obama was elected. We were having a racial reckoning in, pick your date, 1968, 1972, etc., etc. The Civil War is a place where America destroyed itself and then had to recreate itself. And what it recreated came out of all those graves of 1863, 64, 65. Reckoning's a nice word. We like that word because it implies that we're solving something. And we may be. We may indeed be. We hope we are. We're having a reckoning. That means we're getting together on Thursday nights and we're deciding what to do. Or are we? Maybe we're not getting together on Thursday night to decide what to do. Maybe we're just doing some voter registration. I don't know. Now, there are many other reasons this has a hold on us, not the least of which is, can America survive with a social contract that says all are welcome, all are citizens if born here? It says what the three sentences of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment say, and then does it? Can America have a social contract rooted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Yes, we thought so for nearly 50 years, until Shelby v. Holder. Can America have a social contract around certain cultural issues? I don't even need to name them, do I? Until we sometimes find, because of a court decision or something else, that, well, maybe we don't. And can America hold itself together? It did not hold itself together in 1860-61. Can America hold itself together when it fails at devising that unified social contract and has to think of another way forward. A last little point. Had a call last week from a reporter at The Guardian. He said, I just want to talk to you about this one main question. These guys, they have to write an article and it was due an hour ago. He says, I'm trying to write a piece about, has America ever faced an election cycle that seemed this divisive, this dangerous? He kept using these words. He was kind of stumbling along. And I said, sir, this is a big one, but as long as you don't use the word ever, because you're forgetting 1860. He said, oh yeah, no, that's right, that's, yeah. That one broke up the Union. It led to civil war. You can say it didn't have to if you want, but it did. So work on that ever, and then go for it. It's just a big one. And here, we talked for like 45 minutes. So what are the ingredients of division that were there in 1860 that may or may not be there now? And some of those parallels don't work. They just don't. Some do. Some do. Like a decrease in confidence in institutions that hold us together. I actually never read his piece. I hope he got the word ever out of it. I don't know. Okay, undergraduates, you are going to meet your sections next week. And I'm going to introduce real quickly my TAs. Jackie Wu, raise your hand, Jackie. Emily Yankowitz, Wolf Solar, and Ella Starkman Himes. All are advanced graduate students here in the history department. Wolf and Emily are early Americanists primarily. Ella is a Civil War Reconstruction historian. Jackie is a 20th century historian of Asian American history and many other things. And I am blessed to have them working with me. So sign up. Sections are there to be chosen. And to everybody else, you're supposed to send your questions through Michael Hepp, who has supposedly sent all of you the syllabus. Is that a yes or no? Yes. All right. Thank God. And I will see you next Tuesday.